Okay, if people could take your seats, we're going to get started because we have to keep the senator on schedule. We're going to have a little more flexibility in the afternoon. I hope we can get some discussion of our excellent presentations this morning. And again, my thanks to our presenters. I'm going to just hand it over to our Vice President for International Affairs, Matt Gutman, who has done an exciting job at Brown, linking us to the rest of the world and really changing the university. So thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep my introductions quite brief, but I hope somewhat on the passionate side. I have a sister-in-law who is an environmental activist in Rhode Island, and it's rare that she has anything nice to say about anyone in politics. She speaks extremely favorably about the first person I'm going to introduce, Senator Whitehouse, who is on the in the Capitol, I think, really one of the most passionate voices for some of the issues that we're addressing and some of the concerns that everybody in this room has. So it's a real pleasure to welcome back to Brown, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Professor Timmons Roberts, Matt Gutman, and other members of the Brown family who are here. It's a pleasure for me to be with you. This is an important event, and I'm glad to be a part of it. The event's promotional materials ask this question: how will China manage rapid economic growth without ignoring climate change? I would ask, how could China and the United States ensure economic growth and national security without addressing climate change? I think our starting point has to be to acknowledge that climate change is real and that carbon pollution causes climate change. I doubt there's a whole lot of dispute over those facts around here, but a peculiar condition of Washington, where the dark hand of the polluters can tap so many shoulders, is to deny these facts. So let's address them just for a moment, because the special interests, the polluters, are propagating one very big lie, and that is that the jury is still out on whether climate change is caused by carbon pollution. So we don't need to worry about it, or for sure, don't waste time taking precautions. Virtually all of our most prestigious scientific and academic institutions warn that climate change is happening and that human activities, carbon specifically, is what is driving this change. Members of Congress received a letter in October 2009 stating this: observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver. These conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. As you'll notice, there's a lot of very strong language in that paragraph. This letter was signed by the heads of 18 scientific organizations: the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Chemical Society, Geophysical Union, Institute of Biological Sciences, Meteorological Society, Society of Agronomy, Plant Biologists, Statistical Association, Botanical Society, and more. I'm not going to go through all 18, but it's really the crowning organizations of the scientific world. These organizations know that the jury is not still out. They recognize that the verdict is in fact in, and that it's time to act. More than 97% of the most actively publishing climate scientists accept that the verdict is actually in on climate change and on carbon pollution causing climate change. Think of that statistic for a minute in the context of the merchants of doubt that have been operating. Imagine if your child were sick and you took them to a doctor and the doctor said, yeah, your child is sick, she's going to need treatment. So you're a prudent parent and you go and you get a second opinion. And the second doctor said, yeah, your child is sick and she's going to need treatment. Just to be extra prudent, you went and got a third opinion, and the third doctor said, yep, your child is sick, and she is going to need treatment. And let's say you were really, really, really anxious, and so you went and you got 94 more opinions. Actually, I did the math wrong. 97 more opinions, so that you had a full 100. And of those 100 opinions, 97 of those doctors agreed, yes, your child is sick and needs treatment. What reasonable parent in those circumstances would listen to the three doubters and not take the prudent steps to protect the interests of their child? The doubt about this is frankly preposterous. And indeed, with respect to climate change, the doubt is manufactured. How solid is the real science? It is rock solid. The fact that carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere goes back to the time of the American Civil War. In 1863, the Irish scientist John Tyndall determined that carbon dioxide and water vapor trapped more heat in the atmosphere as their concentrations increased. By the early 1900s, it became clear that changes in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere might account for significant increases and decreases in the Earth's annual average temperatures, and that carbon dioxide release, primarily the burning of coal, would contribute to these changes. This is not new stuff. These are long-established scientific principles. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have burned carbon-rich fuels in measurable and ever-increasing amounts, now up to 7 to 8 gigatons a year. A gigaton, for the record, is 1 billion metric tons. Releasing all this carbon into our atmosphere has predictably increased carbon concentration in our atmosphere. Put more in, find more there should not be a difficult proposition. And putting 7 to 8 billion metric tons into the atmosphere every year is a pretty big thing. Over the last 800,000 years, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has stayed within a bandwidth of 170 to 300 parts per million. That's measurement. That is not theory. Scientists measure carbon dioxide from those periods by locating trapped air bubbles in the ice of ancient glaciers. And carbon concentrations have now climbed out of that bandwidth. This is also a measurement, not a theory. The present concentration exceeds 390 parts per million. So we've had 800,000 years of 170 to 300 parts per million as our range, and now we've shot out of it to over 390 parts per million. That increase also has a trajectory. Plotting trajectories is also nothing very new or complicated. It is something that scientists, business people, our military services do every day. The trajectory for our carbon pollution predicts 688 parts per million in the year 2095 and 1,097 parts per million in the year 2195. Those carbon concentrations are outside the bounds not just of the past 800,000 years, but of millions of years. To put this in perspective, mankind first started scratching the dirt and engaging in agriculture about 10,000 years ago. 800,000 years ago, it's not clear we'd yet figured out mastering fire. Millions of years goes back into geologic time. Under the pressure of propaganda efforts like ClimateGate, which I actually would call ClimateGate Gate, because the real scandal was the fabrication of a phony scientific controversy, the percentage of Americans who believed that climate change was happening dropped from 71% in 2008 to 57% in 2010. Since that time, there's been a rebound. Today, about 63% of Americans believe climate change is happening. The propaganda campaign continues, but the evidence is becoming too powerful to ignore. Each week in the Senate, I circulate a one-page summary of the latest climate news to my colleagues in the Democratic caucus. Senators Boxer, Kerry, and Merkley join me in this effort. To prepare for this document each week, I review scientific abstracts and news articles, and I've reported over the past month that on March 21st, the National Weather Service announced that 4,412 temperature records had been broken over the previous 7 days. New research published in Environmental Research Letters predicts that the 3.7 million Americans living within a few feet of high tide are at risk of being hit by more frequent coastal flooding in coming decades because of sea level rise caused by global warming. That, of course, is a big deal for the ocean state of Rhode Island. And third, just another one, is that new review of geologic records shows that seas, our oceans, are acidifying faster than at any time in the past 300 million years, a period that encompasses 4 mass extinctions. Ocean acidification, I believe, is the effect of carbon pollution that will hit us first and hardest as a species. The laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of science, these are laws of nature. They are laws of God's earth. We can repeal some laws in the Senate. We can't repeal those. Senators are used to having their opinions matter. Our opinions do not matter to these laws. Because these are laws of nature, because we can neither repeal nor influence them, we have a duty of stewardship to see and respond to the facts that are before our faces. We bear a duty to shun the well-paying polluters. We bear a duty to make the right decisions for our children and our grandchildren and our God-given earth. And right now, we are failing in that duty. However, we can and we must change the course of this history and address carbon pollution before it's too late. Earlier this week, the trade newswire E&E published a story entitled, "As Climate Becomes Less Certain, So Does China's Ability to Feed Itself." The story reported that in 2011, droughts claimed grains that could have fed 60 million Chinese for a whole year. Because China's agriculture depends so much on rivers and deltas fed by the Himalayan glaciers, China is very vulnerable. Our two countries then face daunting challenges as our climate changes. Our two countries likewise cause climate change through our emissions. The United States has emitted more carbon dioxide in the past 200 years than any other country. However, China now emits more carbon dioxide per year than any other country. We can argue endlessly about which country must do more to stop carbon pollution, but the atmosphere, our oceans, the melting ice caps do not care where the carbon dioxide is coming from. To nature, there is no difference between American carbon dioxide and Chinese carbon dioxide. I often hear that the United States was allowed to develop without regard to air pollution or climate change, and that every other country should have that same right. I absolutely agree that people, regardless of national origin, have the right to electricity, to running water, and to the benefits of development. But there's more than one path to that goal. Developing countries rightly leapfrogged traditional landline telephone technology, moving straight to cell phones. Likewise, we should work together, China and the United States, with other developing nations, to leapfrog dirty energy technology. I applaud President Obama's and President Hu Jintao's leadership in this regard, establishing the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This type of partnership is an important part of our two nations' leadership on this issue. We must also take direct action to reduce our carbon emissions. Both countries have faced obstacles making these changes at the national level, although China has set carbon intensity reduction targets, and the US EPA recently proposed rules to vastly curb carbon emissions from new power plants. Meanwhile, both countries are experimenting at the state and provincial levels of government. China has launched an emissions trading regime in 7 provinces. 9 northeastern states in the United States are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, a trading regime that is on track to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector 10% by 2018. We should share our experiences with these state and provincial experiments and build from these regional successes to find national as well as international solutions. You have the experts in this conference to talk about the specific ways that the US and China can work together to provide leadership on the issue of climate change. I applaud you in these important efforts and assure you that you do have allies in the United States Congress. Nature is sending us warning signals, telling us that we must act before we are too late. Researchers find new evidence of climate change every day. Our military and intelligence institutions, technical experts in government agencies, business leaders, major investors, the insurance industry, and local folks who are seeing the changes in their lives, whether they're fishermen, farmers, wildlife biologists. So many voices are now warning us of the dangers of inaction. Ultimately, decision makers in our respective countries are duty-bound to find solutions to this, perhaps the most daunting challenge of our time. Thank you very much. Want me to take questions, please? Yeah, sure. Happily. Professor Roberts was asked if I'd stay for a few questions, and the answer is yes. If there are any. Yes, sir.
I'm Mizan Khan from Bangladesh, currently spending this semester with Professor Timmons. I have a question. I have been a student in the 90s for 8 years in America, so I have a basic grounding on American politics. As an outsider, my basic question is, you have mentioned that more than 60% of Americans support climate change issues, kind of. So why is it not being reflected in policy? Because 60% is more than a majority.
That is a very good question, and it points to a continuing conflict in American politics between the general wishes of the American public and the influence of special interests on their elected officials in Washington. There are innumerable areas in which this conflict is apparent. When we return to Washington next Tuesday, we will be voting on a piece of legislation that I drafted to assure that individuals in the United States who make more than $1 million, more than $2 million in income in a year don't end up paying a lower tax rate than a truck driver does, making $40,000 a year. That is a bill that has immense support in the public. But the hedge fund billionaires and other folks who have a vested interest in that legislation are pushing very hard against it. And it may take several votes before the American public gets alert to what's going on this particular issue in Congress at this time and begins to get on the phone and call in and say, what on earth are you doing, you crazy person? I think this should be done. And then their representatives begin to listen. But there is a constant gap in Congress between what Congress feels is important in terms of the opinions of the special interests that have the most sway in Congress and the knowledge, wishes, desires, and dreams of the American public. And that is one of the great frustrations of being in the job that I'm in. The minority can, in fact, control, as long as it has the resources at its disposal, to bottle things up, to sell its own line of propaganda, and to reward those who will ignore the public and stick with them when these votes come up. Yeah.
My name is Kelly Rogers, and I'm a master's student at the Taubman Center for Public Policy here. And my question relates to the moderate Democrats, the Blue Dog Democrats, as well as the moderate Republicans,
Yeah.
and some refer to them as the Main Street Caucus.
Yeah.
So you're never really going to convince Senator Inhofe or the extreme climate deniers of
Yeah.
this problem. But what windows of opportunity do you see to convince the more moderate groups within Congress about the seriousness of this problem?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that
Could the question be repeated?
sure. What are the means that we have to try to convince the more moderate members of Congress about this, even if we have to give up on the more extreme members like Senator Inhofe? And I think the answer has two dimensions to it. One is simply giving it attention and making sure that people really understand what the consequences are. And that's why I put out my climate newsletter every single week to my colleagues. That's why I stand up in the caucus and remind people when things are coming up that are significant. I bet that there are not more than 5 members of the Senate who could tell you that the bandwidth for 800,000 years was 170 to 300, and that we're now at 390 and that we're headed out. They may have a general sense that, it's high and that it may be having some effect, but in the clutter of information that a senator is subjected to, you've got to kind of persist and be very, very clear. So we can do better at that. I try to do my best, but we certainly could be doing better. The second is that even people who get it and are 100% convinced, if you're Claire McCaskill from Missouri, you've got a real concern about this because 100% of Missouri's electric generation is coal. So if there isn't a plan for helping Missouri to maintain regular power rates, it's going to take an economic hit that she has a duty to her state citizens to try to protect against. And that was the great tragedy of the cap and trade regime falling down, because it provided the revenues that could have been reallocated to help hard-hit states like Missouri for its electric rates, West Virginia for its employment, to make adjustments. Rhode Island will do fine if this happens. We actually are winners. We burn virtually no coal. We get some from Brayton Point down the road, but there's none burned in Rhode Island. And we face the environmental problems from, we're a downwind state. So when they burn this stuff in Missouri and other states, it comes over Rhode Island as ozone, and we have what you hear on the drive time radio in the morning, the announcement saying that on a day that looks just like today, babies should stay indoors in the air conditioning, senior citizens should stay indoors, anybody with breathing difficulty should stay indoors, and everybody should avoid vigorous outdoor activity. Why is that announcement being made? It's not because of pollution from Rhode Island. It's because of pollution from these upwind Midwestern power plants that is coming to us in the form of ozone. So there are winners and losers in this, and if we can't find a way to counterbalance a bit so that the losers don't take it in the chin economically quite so hard, they've got a legitimate grievance about the way we solve this. So it's those two things combined together that I think will allow us to get reasonable people in the middle who see this as a real problem and want to react, but can't have businesses shuttered across their state because of it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Selix, and I work for the World Resources Institute in Beijing. And
Welcome to Brown.
Thank you. My daughter graduated from Brown last year.
Very
so
cool.
I'm happy to come here. I took Al Gore's training in how to give the inconvenient truth speech last year in Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
And there was constant pushback from the Chinese participants. Yes, we know the problem, let's talk about the solutions, and let's not spend 85% of the speech talking about the risks, because we all know what they are, the science is overwhelming, let's talk about the solutions, let's talk about the opportunities. And if you go to a climate conference in Beijing, it's all about energy efficiency and renewable energy and nuclear power and carbon capture and storage. It's not a lot about the problems that you listed. And I'm wondering why the conversation in the United States is still so heavily about the risks and the problems, and whether what we're lacking is the optimism about the solutions, and the shared interest is to get people focused on the incredible business opportunities and quality of life opportunities of transforming an energy system.
Yeah.
And there's good jobs in changing one's energy infrastructure.
I think that you're wise to point out that there are two elements to this, and if all you're doing is confronting people with an unpleasant fact without an action that can be taken to remedy that actually is to the good for everyone, you put yourself in an unnecessarily bad position, particularly when there is such a story to tell. And so usually when I talk about this, I do talk about local jobs and things that we can do in Rhode Island and how important it is that they're hardening up the Quonset piers so that the giant cranes can ride up and down them in order to put the wind turbine nacelles on the barges and get them out to where the wind farm is going to be built in Block Island Sound. But I think unlike China, you'd know better than I whether it's this way in China or not, but certainly in the United States, we have a very sophisticated propaganda operation that is operating more or less constantly to deny the fundamental fact of this. And if you don't believe in that, I think you need both in order to be effective. You've got to have a problem and a solution, and then people have a way to act. And as long as the deniers are able to win on whether or not there's a problem, then I think going to the solution, you just don't have the traction to get there. So I think the two have to be conjoined. And I would add that the deniers have a huge advantage, which is that they don't have to win the debate in order to succeed. All they have to do is raise enough doubt that the public goes on to other things. If it's not clear, I got other things to worry about. And they're expert at it. And we have both institutions and even individuals who have been through creating doubt about whether cigarettes were bad for your health, creating doubt about whether lead paint was poisonous, and now creating doubt about whether climate change is real. Now, if you're a scientist, you tell me what the specialty thread is that connects expertise on the toxic qualities of cigarettes, the toxic qualities of lead paint, and the realities of climate change and carbon pollution. I think the thread that joins those is a willingness to say things for money. And it reflects that there is, in fact, a little mini industry within the scientific community that does this repeatedly, and that they've worked out a strategy on this. And so it's really important to push back, because we're at that disadvantage of having to kind of convince people. All they have to do is a little aliquot of doubt and they're home free. Yeah.
Sheldon, would you talk for a minute about President Obama's posture on some of this? So for example, the president strikes me as somebody who gets it with respect to energy policy, and his appointments kind of reflect that. And on the other hand, we're exporting oil right now, and we have elevated gasoline prices, and we actually probably could liberate ourselves completely from oil in this country at the moment. So a strong president could actually say, we don't need it. We actually can replace our demand for oil pretty much with gas for this period of time as a bridge.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm asking, I understand the political realities, but I'm asking what a stronger president might do to help clarify the difference between the Democratic Party and his Republican challengers on the issue of the role of petroleum in our economy.
Well, actually talking about climate change would be a pretty good start.
It would.
There is abundant evidence popping up literally every day. I mean, my climate change news piece is a weekly, and we're never at a loss for it has 4 elements to it. We're never at a loss for filling in those 4 things that we put on the page every week. And what is not present is a compelling narrative and a megaphone that project that narrative so that people can assemble that data and understand that when you have for the first time $12 billion storms in a year, you can't necessarily attach any one of those storms to climate change. But if climate change is really happening, you're going to see more of those, and it's going to load the dice so that they come more often. And so it actually is connected. And we're not telling that story well enough, and the White House is virtually not telling it at all. And it's probably the single area where I'm most disappointed in the White House. I actually think that we probably could have passed a climate change bill before the last election if we'd saddled up in the Senate and had the fight. The president could have pushed for it. He could have put his national security establishment out there, a lot of generals in gold braid, a lot of intelligence professionals saying this is serious, this is going to affect our national security. They've reported it already. It's just a question of putting attention to those reports. Business leaders from across the country, everybody from banks to the insurance industry to some of our major electric utilities to investors who are seeing this as a huge opportunity. There's an enormous group to be marshaled to push on this if we could, and we were just one vote in the Senate away from it. And frankly, had we done it, even if we had lost, I think we would have done better in the election because we would have gone into it fighting rather than explaining why TARP wasn't such a bad thing. And I think it's important for us to leave a mark for the future that we were fighting for this now. I mean, 40, 50 years from now, the economic strains that bedevil Rhode Island and that harm our country right now are going to be something for the textbooks, something for the history books. But Americans will be living with the consequences of climate change, and it will be very real, it will be very dramatic, it will dominate the way that they live, and they will look back at this moment when we could have done something about it and say, where were they? And I think it's very unfortunate when the president doesn't see that as that kind of a teaching moment, if you will, not just for now, but for history as well. Yeah.
I'd just like to contribute some thoughts from Peggy Lou.
But hang on, let me just say, I 100% support him. And the fact that his support for this issue is, to me, unfortunately faint, is still a huge improvement over the other side, which has been completely co-opted by the special interests and the deniers to the point where they actually want to make it worse. And they're just, I think, in an extraordinarily extreme position. So I don't want anybody reading this to say, oh, he was criticized, the White House is, or they, no, I'm 100% on board, and yes, they are way worse on the other side than we are. Yeah, sorry.
Peggy Lou is a Chinese American who lives in Shanghai with her family. She comes to Rhode Island every summer. And she set up an organization called the Joint U.S.-China Collaborative on Clean Energy. It's JUCCCE, if you want to go on the web.
Yeah.
And she found that one difference between China and the United States is that if you get a few people who get it in China, you can make more change quickly.
If they're the right people.
In this country.
If they're the right people.
There's good and bad things about that.
Yeah.
That's an issue. The other thing, one of the other things she's communicated in meetings here is that in China, everybody eats, drinks, breathes, tastes pollution 24 hours a day, even if they're in an air-filtered building. And so they get it, they know that this can't go on. Chinese leadership and the Chinese people recognize that if they keep on trying to replicate the American dream, that's going to be a catastrophe for themselves. And they're trying to now work on creating a new Chinese dream, and we'll see what comes of that.
Yeah. Well, we do have different political establishments, China and the U.S., and we each have our disabilities from that, and the disability of the American political system is, as I was saying earlier, the disproportionately weighted effect of special interests that have been around a while, know how to work Washington, and can put a lot of money behind their arguments, and that they can trump public opinion virtually every time until somebody comes along and galvanizes that public opinion to not just be a latent opinion, but to move into action. And that's why, as I was saying to Carolyn, my disappointment with the White House is so great, because I think they do have that capability to move it from latent opinion into action, had they been willing to take that chance.
So one more question or comment?
Yes, in the back.
I have a question. As a student interested in climate change and creating a more successful narrative about why we need to transition our economy away from fossil fuels, what is, if you could pick like the single action that students could take, what would you say that that would be?
The thing that I would like to do, that I think would be more effective than anything else, would be to, and students could easily do this, would be to have a climate wiki where somebody like me could go state by state and find out what is going on in a particular state and who locally in that state is saying something about it. So that when Jim Inhofe stands up and says climate change is a great big hoax, I can access right away the wildlife commissioner of the state of Oklahoma, who is saying that we don't have quail any longer because the summers are too hot and the eggs are being eaten, or whatever. That the guy at the Department of Meteorology at the University of Oklahoma just published a report saying this. That down in Florida, the mayor of a town has just asked that a bond be issued to relocate the sewage treatment facility because the threat of sea level rise is going to put it out of use in a couple of years, and they need to prepare for that. There is ground truth that is the one thing that trumps special interest money. And that, and just kind of animating the entire public. But when you are challenging somebody who is a climate denier, and you're challenging them not with the Sierra Club, because they've already learned to discount that. They've learned their talking points about why the Sierra Club is a bunch of, you know, pointy-headed Eastern liberal smart alecks who have an ulterior motive to get money, whatever. When it's their mayors, when it's their CZMA agency, the Coastal Commission, when a bridge out to the islands in North Carolina has to be raised 4 feet to prepare for sea level rise, when things are indisputably happening that are indisputably home state, and now they're arguing with a professor at the University of Oklahoma, now they're arguing with the governor's appointees on the Coastal Commission in North Carolina, now they're arguing with a coastal mayor in Florida, you have a completely different debate. Nobody has done a good job of assembling that information. There is not a place you can go where it's aggregated. And every time I talk to environmental groups, NRDC, Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, whoever, that's what I ask. They say, what can we do? I said, that's what I want you to do. What I want you to do is to pull together this information so that it's accessible somewhere. There should be an Encyclopedia Britannica of local information that confirms what is happening right now, undeniably, in people's home states and towns as a result of climate change. If I had that material, I could be much more effective. If the Sierra Club had that material, it could be that much more effective. Individual advocacy could be much more effective if it was informed by that material. And it's out there to be had, it's just never been aggregated. So maybe we could convince Google to build a special, like, climate denier refutation section where stuff gets populated into it and you can call them out. You know, and they're there. They are there. There are professors in the local universities who are telling the truth because they have to. They're real professors. They're scientists. They can't make this stuff up. There are wildlife commissioners who are sometimes even elected folks who get it because the ducks are flying differently in their state and they are reporting it, or the trout aren't in this river this year because the temperature has changed or the flow has changed. Those are the things we need to catalog, and we need to make it granular, because being told from the top by the environmental community, you know, Al Gore probably does us more harm than good at this point because they have done such a good job of branding him as somebody that you don't need to listen to. So that was a really good question to end on, and there's a takeaway for anybody who's interested in this. I'd love to work on this. I keep pushing, and here's another little push, because that info, the bad side of Washington is that special interest money has undue sway. The good side of Washington is that when people from home say something, that really is a trumper in most circumstances, but you've got to be able to organize and marshal that force. So thank you everybody very much. Happy Easter holiday. Matt, thank you for having me. Timmons, thank you very much.
Thanks very much to Senator Whitehouse.
Hang on, let me
Oops,
scoop that
sorry.
folder out of there. All yours.
Very good. And actually, this is a perfect combination because we started to get into some of the policies and politics of the current administration, and I'm sure they're going to be ably represented here by Dan Riefsnyder, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Environment and Sustainable Development at the U.S. Department of State. One of the interesting things, we have a number of students in here, and I know that students often ask about participation in joining government entities. And I do not know Mr. Riefsnyder, but I'm just guessing that the issue of climate change is one that he cares personally about in a very profound way and that he knows a great deal about. At the same time, you go into government and sometimes you get into contradictions in terms of what you can represent and how. So I would also encourage students to raise questions about that in terms of how do you actually advance some of the things that we care about at the same time that you're representing the views of a broader entity like the U.S. government. So please join me in welcoming Dan Riefsnyder.
There's more seats up here. People are looking for some of those seats.
Well, thank you, and that was a tough act to follow, I have to say. Coming after Senator Whitehouse and before lunch, they really kind of did me in, you know. In any event, I wanted to mention one thing. Our host just said that you all might ask me some questions about what it's like to work for the government on this issue. And there's one little anecdote I'd love to tell you, because I've been working on the climate issue almost forever, as people will tell you. I began in 1989, and I've survived multiple administrations and so forth, which no one can quite understand, but here I am. And the interesting thing was, in 1999, I was able to get away for a couple years, and I went off to teach and some other things. And I came back in 2001, and I met with a group of high school students in September of 2001. And they asked me, they said, well, what is it like, you know, working for the federal government in what you do? And I said, well, in 1999, when I went away, implementing the Kyoto Protocol was the single overriding priority for my office. And I said, I've come back now in September of 2001, and not implementing the Kyoto Protocol is the single overriding priority for my office. I said, so yeah, you have to be flexible, you know? An anecdote. The other thing I would tell you is that 1 year ago today was a very bad day for me, very bad day in my life. I had a horrible day because I was in Bangkok. It was the first meeting of the, what we called the AWG-LCA, the Ad Hoc Working Group on Long-Term Cooperative Action. And in a very unusual twist of fate, I was the chairman of that group. And I remember walking into the center that day, and I ran into a Bulgarian friend of mine. She had actually chaired one of the major bodies under the Framework Convention years ago. And she looked at me and she said, Daniel, they will be very mean to you. She said, but don't worry, it's not personal, you know. They were very mean to me. It was a very tough meeting. It took us 5 days, 7 days, I think, to agree on an agenda. And I thought I had the record as the person who'd presided over the longest effort in the UN to adopt an agenda. I mean, it's an embarrassment to come home and they say, what'd you do with your whole week there? You know, we adopted a 2-page agenda. But that record was quickly broken in June when the other bodies under the Framework Convention met, and it took them even longer. So I just want to make that note. So today has to be better than that, right? I would like to kind of give you, I'm going to go through kind of a couple of anecdotes that I think will sort of put some images in your head of at least the way I see things. I see things in kind of images of things all the time. And I remember in, just before I left, in about 1988, a fellow that I knew from the private sector came into my office. And he said, well, how are things going? And I looked at him in shock and disbelief, and I said, what do you mean, how are things going? I said, they're horrible, you know? We're getting killed on the Hill. We're being trashed and told that we're trying to implement Kyoto through the back door. You know, it's just a very difficult time. I said, how do you think things are going? And he said, oh, they're going pretty well. I said, explain it to me. He said, well, there's really no debate out there anymore about the science. He said, now what people are really looking at is what to do about it, which, given what we've just heard, is a rather interesting comment in 1998. But the very interesting thing about this, it made me realize, and it fits in with this talk today, that in effect, I was living in a box. And within that box, things were terrible. There were lightning bolts and thunder and rain, and it's just horrible. But the box, I realized, was sitting on a table, and the table was moving. And that's really the kind of image I'd like to give you of this issue in terms of China and in terms of the United States, in terms of what's going on, because there is a lot going on. Things are moving forward. There are tremendous developments in both countries. But if you gauge it from the negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we're still back in the dark ages. I mean, it's a very difficult place. As friends of mine who are sitting here in the audience will tell you, they've been there. Fortunately, they got out, you know. It's a very difficult thing. And I was thinking today about the United States and China, and I woke up with an image. This may be partly a cultural thing, and if so, I apologize, but anybody here, are you even old enough to remember what cotillion was? Did anybody have to go to cotillion? It's a sort of for kids who are about age 6th grade to 8th grade, where you dress up and you go and you learn how to ballroom dance. You know, and it's always very difficult because the girls are always sitting on one side of the hall and the boys are always sitting on the other. And, you know, some are tall, some are short, and it's very, you know, anxiety provoking and that kind of thing. And I thought about this because I thought, you know, the United States and China are like two gangly kids at a cotillion. They're big, they're very big, so they stand out. What nobody wants is to stand out. What everybody wants is to kind of blend in, you know, not be too visible. And yet, the United States today is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. China is the first. It's a very interesting situation. I remember, not the first time, but maybe one of the first times that I met Shuiman was in, and let me just say, I want to congratulate everybody here on the cast of speakers today, because this is an incredible group. Debbie Seligson, whom I've known for years, coming from Beijing, and Mark Levine, and Shuiman Wang, and Yinlong. I haven't known you before, but I'm just overwhelmed at this is small. I was told it would be 10 to 100. It may be a little less than 100, but it's really quality, I have to say. Anyway, I remember in 1997, before we adopted the Kyoto Protocol, I went to Beijing and I met with Shuiman. And in the meeting that I had there with the fellow who was directing the state office of, it was called the Sustainable Development Commission, looked at me. The very first thing he said in my meeting was, he said, you know, he said, today China is #2 in the world in terms of CO2 emissions. And I said, yes, I know. And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, we don't want to be #1. And it was, that was also very interesting. And of course, then you saw what Mark had to say about the paths having crossed a little bit. But in any event, both countries are in this very interesting situation. They both stand out. Everyone looks to the United States and China, I think, above all, for where is this issue going? What is going to happen? Overall, they're 40% of global emissions. So without them, and without a means of moving forward, things can become stuck. I would also like to tell you, well, another little anecdote. I might not fit in really well, but very often I'm in these negotiations and people from developing countries will, fall back on the excuse. They'll say, well, Mr. Chairman, I'm very sorry, but, English isn't my mother tongue. And the same person that Shuiman referred to, who claimed at one point that China would always be a developing country, one day I remember he said in one of our negotiations, he said, oh no, Mr. Chairman, we cannot have that formulation because if we did, we would have a dangling participle. And I went out, we both smoked in those days. I went out to see him during a break in the hallway and I said, Mr. Zhang, please, after that comment today, no more of this business about how English isn't my mother tongue, okay? But the other one that came from Su Wei, my good friend in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, no longer, he's in the Ministry of NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, was when I was chairing the LCA in Durban. And at one point I said that I was going to produce by Saturday an amalgamation text. And he challenged me. He said, well, what is this we're hearing, Mr. Chairman, about you're producing an acclamation text? And I said, well, no, I didn't say, I said English is kind of funny, things sort of sound alike, but they're really a little bit different. I'm talking about an amalgamation text. And he said, oh, I'm so relieved. I thought you were going to produce an acclamation text, and we don't want any acclamation texts here in this body. It was very interesting. It's one of the best, most incisive comments, and I was just stunned by that. I've never forgotten it. It was really terrific. But Shuiman said we have a kind of understanding among the negotiators. That's because we live with each other. We live with each other more than our spouses, frankly. We spend more time with the negotiators than we do with our spouses. But I would say that two things really characterize China in the negotiations above all, and I think I'd be interested if anybody wants to argue with me about this. I don't think so, because I've been around long enough that I can see it. The first is China has been very keen on principles that guide actions. And I think if you find yourself in a negotiation with China, one of the very first things that the Chinese will want to do is start talking about principles before they talk about anything else. And lo and behold, we have a principle under the Framework Convention called the Principle of Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capabilities. I want to make sure we get both pieces in. This is, I think, the overarching principle for China, and you will hear it all the time. It's a way, I think, of sort of saying, okay, yeah, maybe we have to do something, but you have a much greater responsibility to do something. And it's a way of shifting, of changing who has to go forward, who has to go first. I'd say respective capabilities is an important piece of this, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, because if you look at it as responsibilities is kind of an historical thing. It sort of says you are guilty for something you did in the past and therefore you must take actions to fix it. I think many people find that's not a terribly uplifting way to encourage people to take action, by saying you're bad and you need to take action to clean up your act. A much better way to influence people and to encourage action is to say, you have such opportunities, such capacity to do good in the world, that you really have a responsibility to use that for the benefit of the planet. And to my way of thinking, it's one reason I've always tried to emphasize the respective capabilities piece of that. I think it's a very important aspect and a much better motivator than the historic responsibility issue, which is also changing as time goes on. But anyway, one of the principal things about China is devotion to principles, and devotion in particular to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The second thing that I think you will find in all the negotiations I've had with the Chinese is a very intense interest in technology and in technology transfer. Not so much finance, I think, because China, as wealthy as it is today, and I realize on a per capita basis, as Mark was saying, that's different, but overall, China is an extraordinarily wealthy country today. And I don't think China really qualifies for that much in terms of finance, in terms of traditional finance from various entities. But China has been passionate about technology and technology transfer, which raises a number of questions. Well, what is it about technology that China wants? What is China looking for when it comes to technology? That I don't think is entirely clear, and hasn't been entirely clear, at least in the time I've been dealing with it. One of the things we've started to do under the Framework Convention that may help is the whole push to create a technology executive committee and a climate technology center and network, which would be a place where developing countries could go for help with various aspects of climate technology, both with respect to mitigation and adaptation. It's a way of taking the commitments under the convention and making them real by actually using experts from in different fields and helping perhaps deploy them to developing countries to work on particular problems or to help answer questions and so forth. Of course, the needs of China in that regard, I wonder to what extent China will really be utilizing a facility like that, because they have so much capacity to get what they're looking for from many other sources. But I think for other countries, for some of the smaller developing countries, it may be a very, very critical piece of the action. It remains to be seen that it's just being stood up as a result of what happened in Durban. So technology is really an important piece of things, but it's not clear, as I say. I'd be interested if you all have experience with China and technology, what it is that China wants or what it is that China is looking for. China says it's technology transfer, but China also knows full well that nobody just says, here's some technology, please take what you need. It doesn't work that way in the real world. So what does it mean? Transfer of technology, exactly. One of the interesting things, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly because not only because of lunch, but also because I'd like to get into some questions. The Durban platform for enhanced action on climate change that was negotiated, some of you I think were there in December. I was personally stunned because I chaired the AWG LCA. We produced a text of about 30 pages, and we produced annexes of about 25 pages, all agreed, miraculously, at the end of the day. And in the news accounts I read of what happened in Durban, I don't think anybody referred to that decision at all, that I could tell. It was all about the page and a half on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action and about the extension of the Kyoto Protocol, maybe for how many years, we don't know yet, but all will be revealed in time. You know, those were the two things, and perhaps standing up the clean development, the financial mechanism. Those were the things that really made the headlines, not any of the stuff that happened under the LCA, which was enormous and I think very significant. But in any event, one of the things that is missing from this decision, this page and a half or so on the Durban Platform of Enhanced Action, is a specific reference to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Some people say, well, that means that from whatever point forward, the successor to the Kyoto Protocol is going to mean that developing countries have commitments. I think even developing countries expect to have commitments of some kind. But it's not clear what. And I think my colleagues are going to begin meeting again in May this year. I don't know whether I'll be there this year or not because I'm actually in Bonn. I'm on a leave of absence for 6 months. I think one of the very first things, if Bangkok last year was prologue, I think one of the very first things we're going to start to hear is how everybody is trying to reinterpret what was agreed in Durban. That's usually what you do. You spend at least one meeting where everybody tries to say, I know what that said, but that isn't what it means. Here's what it means to me. So that will be very edifying, you know, and uplifting for you students of the climate process. But I think that what people will say is, well, sure, CBDR is not in the text, but the text is under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change includes CBDR. So, you know, here we go. We continue to dance. There are some very interesting things. I think that Shuiman this morning mentioned them in terms of emissions trading with respect to China. I think that's fascinating. The fact that you have 5 cities and 2 provinces gearing up to launch an internal trading operation. And China, I know, has been speaking to the EU. They've been speaking to us about how this was done. They're trying to learn from others in that respect. Why are they doing it? Why would China do that? China doesn't have any commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, right? And China may say we aren't going to have any commitments under the Framework Convention on Climate Change either. But you never know. I think Shuiman's comment that the period between now and 2020 is a very interesting period for experimentation and development of approaches. But it's also interesting that she said you can't really do it with an emissions intensity target. You have to do it with absolute limits, which is in effect true. We did the clean development mechanism because that tries to work without absolute limits. It tries to work on a basis of what might have been, which is very difficult to figure out. The last thing I think I might say is that I think what is so difficult about the Framework Convention is that in many ways, each year when we have these big meetings, as we had in Copenhagen and Cancun and Durban and so forth, it's a bit of a blame game that takes place, particularly the final week. Because everybody's trying to figure out, okay, who this year is going to be perceived as a leader, and who this year is going to be perceived as the one blocking progress. Shuiman mentioned that China was a scapegoat in Copenhagen. Well, okay, so China got tagged that year, but the thing is we meet every year. And every year, everybody's afraid, am I going to be blamed this year? How do I look good? How do I position myself as a leader? And so forth. That's really, a lot of the energy goes into that, the impressions that are created from that meeting, because that's the time of year, December or November every year, when people get a taste of climate again. So the question is, who's going to be blamed? I mean, first and foremost, or who's going to be perceived as a leader? And how are they going to make that happen? So anyway, I think I'm actually very hopeful about the future. People say, how can you have been around since 1989 and be hopeful about the future? Well, you know, partly I think in geologic terms, so things take time. But I'm very hopeful about the things that I see happening in the world in a practical way. The table moving, the things going on in China, the things going on in the United States, Reggie, California, so forth. I wanted to say to the senator, if he were still here, that I think we're in a bit of a trough right now, and I've watched this happen over the 20-some years I've been involved. The climate issue rises, the climate issue falls. Whether you like it or hate it, the one thing I will tell you is a constant: it never goes away, and it changes. We're in a trough now, it will come back. As sure as I'm standing here, it will be back in the public consciousness. It will be an issue again, and I think people like Senator Whitehouse are the ones who are helping to ensure that that happens. So,
thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for some questions and discussion. If you want to just take those.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Sir, Paul Smith with the Naval War College. I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's going to take a 9/11 type event in order to get the progress in the international framework? I mean, some sort of major cataclysmic type event?
Well, two comments. I've really wondered about that myself, just as a personal matter, because we've had some events like that. If you think about it, Katrina was a good one. Australia had a similar event. There was the fires that took place in Australia. The fires, I understand from talking to colleagues in Australia, changed the national consciousness about the climate issue. People said, this is scary. This changed the view of the entire country. Katrina did not. Katrina was viewed as a bad hurricane, or an unfortunate hurricane that landed in the wrong place. It didn't have an effect. There are things that could have an effect, but you know, whether you'd wish those on anybody or not, I don't think so, because the problem with the climate, the real problem with climate is that by the time you see those problems, it's too late to reverse it. You know, the lag time is so significant that you can't turn. I mean, one of the questions I was asked, I spoke to a class at Georgetown earlier this week, and we talked about. They said, well, what kind of cataclysmic event might you envision? I said, well, the thermohaline circulation in the North Atlantic, for example, if that were to slow or reverse, that would be unbelievable. But if that were to begin to happen, you know, what are you going to do about it? Yeah.
Thank you, Dan, for this very good speech. I have a question and also some comments on Durban platform. A question is that I like your comparison that negotiators live in their own world, the box, and the table move. The table, I think, is world outside the negotiators. So since I was in that box before and I am outside that box, so just one thing that really struggle is that how you really bridge the gap of the negotiators. They have their own world, they use their own terminologies people outside don't really understand. And they struggle with all those COP decisions. Sometimes who really reads them, all those should or shall, so that's one. And then we have the real actions on the ground. And very encouraging. We have seen China, we also have seen Brazil, even we have also seen India and other countries. Really action on the ground, very much encouraging. So this really sets, in your view, how really bridge the gap between the two worlds, because that's very important. So that's one, this is my question. And my comments really about Durban platform. Yes, indeed, it's 1.5 pages, and people would say it's if you declare victory, it's a victory about process, because you look at there's nothing really substantive issues there and very vague. But I would say that it's a process victory. On the other hand, it's a very important victory in the sense that it's a sense of long-term signal to the outside world that the carbon constraints world will be here to stay. Because it's not a Durban platform, it's not about now and 2020, it's about beyond 2020. And say that all the countries were subject to this legally binding, or not legally binding, sorry, was binding policy. So I think that long-term signal is very important. That if not all the countries got, I think China get this signal. So you will see that their 5-year plan will not only 2020, it's beyond 20, because that's the way that they would have to take on action.
Well, thank you, Shui-Man, and it's great to see you here too. I mean, we go back a long way. In terms of the Durban platform decision, I completely agree with you. Debbie made a comment, but Debbie said today in her presentation something that really struck me. She said, in many ways, the negotiations are getting in the way of making progress because people are uncertain about whether to count this or whether to do that because they want to get credit for it and so forth. There was an implication there that somehow the negotiations are a problem for people in the real world, which I completely understand. I can see that because what the private sector tells us all the time is what we need is clarity, certainty, and no change along the way if we can get it. But the interesting thing is the negotiations, for all of the should, shall, will, language and arguing for 7 days over an agenda, the thing that the negotiations do is they truly keep this issue on the public agenda globally. And they send a signal, as you're saying, they send a very clear signal about the direction, the future trend of things. And I think that direction is clearly in the direction of a carbon-constrained world. Now, how that happens and when that happens and where it happens and how this all works is not entirely clear, but I think it's sending a very important signal to everyone. When you asked also then about how do you bridge this gap between the negotiators on the one hand and the public on the other, well, I'm not exactly sure. One of the things I thought about doing is maybe trying to write an article about my year as chair. And I don't want it to be no apologies to my academic friends. I don't want it to be a scholarly article. I want it to be a funny article, because the negotiations and the process are so full of people and so full of hysterical stories and so forth that I think it could really help bring people into the game by exposing them to what the game is and how it's played. They could also look at it and say, what a complete and utter waste of time. I want to get involved in that because I want to make it better. Well, good on you. I mean, welcome. A lot of room on the bench, to make it a better process. So I think partly it may be to have people in the process go out and try to begin to explain this to other people. It's not pretty, it's not great, but when you think about it, what's the alternative? I mean, I think all the time, well, this is horrible and this takes a lot of time, it's very difficult, but what is the alternative? Is there a better alternative? Oh, yeah.
So you're obviously a really good negotiator to have survived in that position since 1989 through all those administrations. And I guess my question for you, there are two negotiators, a negotiator and a former negotiator in the room, is that to what extent, if you were able to be a rogue negotiator and work from the bottom up and just work face to face with Shui-Man and say, here's really what ought to happen, So really say, here's what ought to happen if two countries really sat down. What would you say? So I'm asking, if you actually say you want to almost write your memoirs in the form of an article, what would you say as a rogue negotiator?
Well, I don't think I wouldn't want to consider myself to be a rogue negotiator, but I have done a number of things over time, including one that with, I'll just mention this one in particular. We were having a very difficult time in 1996 over guidelines, developing guidelines for developing country national communications. You saw Shui Jinlong's presentation today about China's national communication or action plan. We had a very difficult time because there was a big difference between developed countries who said this is a critical priority and developing countries said, oh no, there's lots of other things we need to do before we need to worry about guidelines. And I had a big argument with my nemesis, my Chinese nemesis, Mr. Zhang, over this issue. Because he said, when a housewife in China, cooks a meal, she usually starts with rice. And I said, well, I've cooked a few meals in my day, but when I cook a meal, I usually start with a recipe. And we got into the big back and forth in the negotiations over this. But I decided that we needed to have some offline discussion among some of the people who were central to the issue. And so I managed to get the French to organize a meeting in Paris. Tough place to go, I found out that's how you get people to come to your meetings. I got them to have a meeting in Paris to talk about the guidelines before the COP that took place in June, I think, of that year, or July of that year. And it was very interesting because it was critical. Everybody told me it's critical to get China there. And I said, I know. And they said, if you have China, then it counts. If you don't have China, it doesn't count. So I went to the Chinese, I went to our embassy in Beijing and I said, please, would you ask the Chinese to come? They went to the head of the Chinese delegation, who was a woman at the time, and she said, we're too busy, we can't come. And the embassy came back and said, sorry, they say they're too busy. And I said, oh, God, So they said, look, you probably have better relations with them than we do. Why don't you directly appeal to her? So I sent her a fax myself. And I said, please, it's critical we have China come to this. So she gave me good news and bad news. She said, okay, the good news is China will participate. The bad news is, she didn't say it was bad news. She said the bad news for me was she was sending Mr. Zhang. Okay? But actually, in the meeting, Mr. Zhang was quite helpful because he was much older than I am, and he was very skilled, extremely skilled. He used to play with me a lot. I learned some things from him. But anyway, he came to the meeting, and when we got to talking about the very term that Shuiman mentioned this morning, the mitigation word, which was a no-no, you couldn't use this word. He actually, at one point, I heard him give a long speech because he loved long speeches. But he came back and he said, in effect, I got the idea that he said, if you talk about this in terms of abating the increase as opposed to mitigating, that could work. Now, he didn't say that because he had other developing countries there and he didn't want to stand out. But I said, I'm thinking that Mr. Zhang what he's really saying to me is that if we listen to him carefully, that he may be offering us a way through the underbrush. Maybe we could talk about this in this way. And when I got it, he kind of looked at me, and his face didn't change at all, but his eyes, I could tell by his eyes. He looked at me as if to say, you got it, grasshopper. That's right. And I took that, and we went back and we were able, finally, it's a long story, as all these things are, but we were able to get the guidelines agreed at that COP, which was a critical piece of the work under the convention. And it's those kind of relationships, because believe it or not, he and I got to know each other over this time. And it's those kind of relationships between the negotiators that make such a difference. And you don't see them, but that's why bringing some of that out into the public and having people understand that it's not just China, U.S., that it's important.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Or unless,
we could
Timmons, do you want to go on?
People can stand to smell that food anymore.
That's tough, isn't it?
It's getting tougher.
Well, what's gonna, if I may,
oh, sure.
Question. I don't know if this is very comforting or not. As you seem to indicate, as the government changes, negotiation goes on, and the principle behind the negotiation seems not to change. And I can see in the case of Chinese government, because that's a very structured change, maybe since they believe in principles, so that will not change. but politicians in this country talk very differently. Are you implying part president or government talk differently, but they actually leave the details, policy to people really what knows what's going on? Or don't we have to be concerned if the government changes, the position would be completely different?
Well, are you saying do bureaucrats run the country or do politicians? That's a very difficult
Well,
question for me to answer.
No, I'm just saying, does the different government leader coming in would completely change the policy, the principle, the
Leadership,
that
leadership
you have to,
matters. Leadership matters, and leadership comes from the elected officials. You know,
but
we
over
also.
the last 10, 15 years, you don't have to worry about it, but you were able to carry on this negotiation.
Well, for example, one of the things that happened, you know, several people now in the Obama administration, a number of people will say, well, how is it that, you know, you could spend 8 years working in the Bush administration with its policies on climate change versus now you're in this new administration? As they did to me, how could you work for 8 years for Clinton Gore and then you're working 8 years for George W. Bush? I'm a career civil servant. My job is not to make policy. My job is to help people who are elected to make the decisions implement the policies they want to do. The interesting thing during the Bush years, there were a number of very good things that took place. One was, for example, on carbon capture and storage. This was an issue I got very, very interested in when I got away in '99 to 2001, because I realized that we have coal, China has coal, South Africa has coal, India has coal. Many of the big key players in the world have coal. The idea that they're going to leave the coal in the ground and not do anything with it when they're desperate for energy made no sense to me. So I thought there has to be a way we need to try to figure out a way that these countries could maybe use this coal in a way that isn't going to create a problem for the atmosphere. And so when I came back to government in 2001, it was very interesting because there was an undersecretary at the time at the Department of Energy who said, I want to launch a global initiative on carbon capture and storage. And we were also then able to support the IPCC doing a special report on carbon capture and storage. And between those two things, and I give them both, I think, credit, all of a sudden, I used to be able to get in taxis. I'd get in a taxi cab and nobody knew what I was talking about. They might have heard of climate change, but carbon capture and storage, seriously, now I can get in a taxi cab, have a conversation with taxi drivers. They know what carbon capture and storage is. It knocks me out. That was a development that happened at that time. I think there are things, for example, on hydrogen that were begun in that administration. There were things on methane, on Earth observations, et cetera. There were a number of different initiatives that I was involved in that were very positive. And you know, I think those all contribute to the effort going forward.
Maybe one more from Mizan.
Yeah.
Then you have referred to ambiguities in the Durban platform, and there is no CBDR, but you are a supporter of the responsibility, capability part of that principle. Tordestone also claimed victory of having a uniform regime. Okay, now you are not in the government for the time being. So as an academic, what you think should be American strategy to commitments by at least the measure where the responsibility ends in terms of mitigation? Because that is absolutely indeterminate in the text.
Right. In other words, who's responsible for what?
Yeah, no, U.S. approach.
What
defining the responsibilities?
Well, I think, and Shwayman mentioned the term symmetry, which she's absolutely right. That's the latest.
Yeah, but that is vague. Symmetry is vague, you know.
No, it is vague, and that's what I'm saying. The United States has never been saying that developing countries have to have identical commitments. They're saying that the kind of commitments has to be identical. In other words, if the United States is going to have legally binding commitments, then developing countries need to have legally binding commitments. But the kind of commitment, whether it's a commitment for an absolute reduction or a commitment to, in effect, abate the increase, you know, an energy efficiency commitment has been fair game and discussion for a long time. The problem is it's hard to get into having that kind of discussion on the details because people say, no, you know, you are the one who has to do something, not me. And so we want to hear from you first. That's the problem.
There's the core right there.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.